Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. Welcome to the International Conference on Children and Their Families Using Mixed Datasets. My name is Deepak. I'm the Regional Mix Coordinator for the UNICEF Regional Office for Europe and Central Asia. I will be chairing today's online session. The title of this session is Child Labor, as you know. My co-chair is Turgay, who is the Statistics and Monitoring Specialist in the Mix headquarters. Before I introduce our speakers, a few words of housekeeping. You might be knowing if you have already attended, but still I wanted to repeat. This session will be recorded and hosted on the UNICEF Mix website and the YouTube channel, as well as on the Bristol Poverty Institute YouTube channel. By attending this session, you consent to be part of this recording. Please ensure that you have added your name rather than being listed as guest. I see almost all names there. You will be able to ask questions at the end of the presentation. You can use the Q&A function on the top of your screen. You can see the top part. Please note that the chat function is not available to attendees, so please use the Q&A functions. You can write from the beginning as soon as you are listening to presenters, but we will open the Q&A session at the end of all the presentations once it is over. Please be respectful. All events at this conference will be monitored, and we reserve the right to remove attendees in case we see the comments are not comments are deemed offensive or derogatory. So let's start with the presentation. We have three presentations today in this session. The first one would be children as caregivers in low and middle income countries. We have the presenter Monica and Samaneh. Then after that, the presentation will be child work in developing countries, revisiting the difference and similarities between income generating and care and domestic work by Elena and team. And then we will be having third presentation from Utku and other authors. The title would be Compulsory Schooling and Child Labor, the Role of Structural Factors. So let's start with the first presentation. Floor is yours, Monica and Samaneh.
Great. Thank you, Deepak. Let me share the presentation with you all. Is that okay? You can see the slides? Excellent.
Perfect. Please go ahead.
Okay. So thank you for the introduction. My name is Monica Ruiz-Casares. I'm a professor at Toronto Metropolitan University and also McGill University. And I am presenting with my colleague Samaneh Mansouri, who is a doctoral candidate at Université Laval, also in Canada, in Quebec, Canada. We are representing a larger team. You see some of the names of our colleagues here. And in fact, some of them are in the room. Happy to have them join us. We're going to be talking about children as supervisors of other children. We were placed in a child labor session probably due to scheduling, but I wanted to make the point it probably would fit better on a child development or maybe child protection discussion. You'll see why as we present our session. But anyhow, we're very happy to engage in this conversation with you. So child supervision, we know that responsive caregiving is essential for healthy development and well-being of children. In most cases, children are supervised by adults, but that's not always the case. In some cases, children live with other children. That's the case of child-headed households or teenage parents in a more permanent way, but also on a temporary basis, some children spend time unsupervised by adults, what we call children home alone. When children are home alone, they might be completely by themselves, or maybe not, and we will come back to questioning what it means being home alone, particularly in low and middle income countries, or they might be supervising their siblings or other children. That's the population we were to zoom in this study. Children who are caring for other children on a temporary basis in residential care where normally there are adults in the household. What do we know from the literature about what happens when children are caring for other children? Well, we know that there might be some positive and some negative aspects to it. On the one hand, children can experience personal growth, become closer to their siblings and to other family members. They're also socialized into the cultural values of the setting, whereby different members of the family contribute differently for the well-being of the family, and thus increase their resilience individually and the family resilience. And by having to troubleshoot, they develop a number of coping skills. They develop autonomy and self-confidence, and it can strengthen the relationship among the siblings. It's not all beautiful. We also know that unintentional child injuries can increase when children are not properly supervised, and that caring for other children can interfere with the participation, particularly of the supervisors, so the older children, in schools and in other activities. Maybe they might not be able to go out playing because they have to care for their siblings. This might have physical and emotional burden for both the supervisors and the supervisees, meaning the children that are cared for. And in some instances, there might be violence, quarreling among the siblings. So most of the literature on this topic is focused on childhood injuries, unintentional injuries, and mostly focused on very young children. There's very little evidence about what happens with mother's education, what role it might play, and how that might influence the likelihood of children spending time supervising other children. Our hypothesis is that when mothers have higher levels of education, they might be more aware of the risks that happen when children are not properly supervised, and or they might have more financial resources to arrange for alternative childcare options. Most of the literature that exists is not from low and middle income countries, and here is where MIX is a mine for a wonderful gold mine for those of us who love data. And I've been working with this data for the last 15 years. So this particular study is about estimating the prevalence of children under 5 years of age being supervised by another children younger than 10 years without the presence of an adult in a number of low and middle income countries, but also to see how maternal education might influence child-to-child supervision. And I'm going to pass it on to Sam now.
Thank you, Monica. Hello, everyone. As you have seen in the previous slides, and Monica also mentioned, to evaluate our hypothesis about the impact of maternal education on the prevalence of child-to-child supervision in the low and middle-income countries, we first began by analyzing data from 67 countries with optional items on child supervision in the mix, including over 400,000 children. This number may change depending on the maternal education information and information on potential confounding variables. We used the latest wave of the mix, publicly available in July 2021. After removing cases with missing data and excluding countries that lacked information on maternal education or other key variables, our final analysis included 61 countries for one set of analysis and 49 countries for another. Next slide, please. Thank you. Our primary outcome of interest was whether child-to-child supervision occurred. The original responses ranged from 0 to 7 days, but for our analysis, we converted this into a binary variable. 0 indicates that no child-to-child supervision occurred during the past week, while 1 indicates that the child was left alone, left in the care of another child. This data was collected through a survey question asking, on how many days in the past week was the child in our study left in the care of another child, that is someone less than 10 years old, for more than an hour? Maternal education was our main explanatory variable to ensure comparability across different data sets, since education system across countries and the distribution of mother education is very heterogeneous. We categorize maternal education into 2 groups, primary level or below and secondary level or above. However, in some countries, because all respondents had at least a secondary education, we classified this variable into secondary level and above secondary level. Next slide, please. Thank you. To examine whether mother's education play a protective role in this arrangement, we employed random effect Poisson regression model with sampling weights. We began by calculating the crude prevalence of child-to-child supervision without adjusting for any covariates. Then we estimated the adjusted risk rate, focusing specifically on maternal education. In addition to maternal education, we adjusted for several potential confounders, including the child's sex and age, the mother's marital status and age, household residence and size of the household, and also socioeconomic status, as measured by the Wealth Index score, or WIS. For each model, we performed the analysis both with and without accounting for missing value. But in this presentation, we only focus on the result obtained after removing missing data. Next slide, please. Thank you. The unadjusted prevalence of child-to-child supervision varies widely, ranging from 0.4% to 55.7%, with the highest risk rates in the West and Central Africa, ranging from 9.6% in the Gambia to 55.7% in Chad. While the overall lowest risk rates belongs to the Europe and Central Asia, ranging from 1.1% in the Bosnia and Herzegovina to 6.5% in Kyrgyzstan. It is worth mentioning that the lowest risk rate across all countries is 0.4% for Trinidad and Tobago, and a little bit higher with 0.54% for Jamaica. Next slide, please. Thank you. The adjusted risk rate of child-to-child supervision had lower heterogeneity, ranging from 0.15% to 29.3%, with the highest risk rates in the West and Central Africa, ranging from 3.6% in Ivory Coast to 29.3% in Chad, while the lowest risk rates belongs to the countries in Europe and Central Asia, ranging from 0.15% in Kazakhstan to 5.6% in Macedonia. Next slide, please. Thank you. We assessed the association of child-to-child supervision and maternal education across 61 countries containing information on mother's education. Overall, we observed lower prevalence rates of child-to-child supervision associated with higher maternal education in all regions. For example, Panama showed that the risk rate of child-to-child supervision in families with higher maternal education is around 90% lower compared to the ones with lower maternal education. On the other hand, although non-significant, we also observed the opposite pattern in Cuba, Qatar, Samoa, Kyrgyzstan, Costa Rica, and Montenegro. Back to you, Monica.
Thank you, Sam. Of course, like in any study, there are limitations we need to consider when interpreting our findings. First of all, our analysis were done by country. We couldn't pull all the data because there were some variations in sampling and weights. We also included only mixed data, meaning household data, in countries that had publicly available information in July 2021. This means that we cannot extrapolate our findings to children caring for other children in non-residential settings, not household settings, like in residential care or maybe children living in the streets. Most importantly, and I alluded to this at the beginning, local childcare norms change drastically around the world, and despite the mixed efforts to standardize the tools and training the enumerators to administer those questionnaires in a very systematic way, the reality is that how respondents understand the question, what do they understand when we say home alone, likely changes from one context to another, including in some settings it might be perceived as something that is unacceptable. In some cases it might even be punished by the law, considered neglectful practice, and therefore they might be willing or not to disclose, whereas in others it's actually encouraged because it's the way to socialize the child as they grow up to care for the family and for the rest of the community. Another limitation is that we had to exclude some countries. Some alluded to this due to the lack of information on certain variables. And in some cases, we ended up with wide confidence intervals because the prevalence of child-to-child supervision was very low. We had to combine different levels of education. This might have hidden some variations across groups or countries. We have René Imoh is presenting tomorrow in Bristol. If you're present, I encourage you to attend his session where he's going to be further problematizing this issue of how do we measure education in mix. And we lack some relevant indicators across all countries on some variables that would be really important to help us understand child supervision, and most notably childhood injuries. There's no information on these, or even maternal employment. So in conclusion, our data, our study showed that child-to-child supervision without the presence of an adult is a common practice in low and middle income countries. In fact, in some countries, this is a very common childcare arrangement. Maternal education seems to be protective in most countries, but there are some exceptions that would require mixed method studies. I'll come back to this later. Probably mothers with higher level of educations might be more aware of the dangers of inadequate supervision, or they might have access to better jobs, better income that allows them to hire a nanny or sign up the child for some daycare facility. And finally, we need to consider the political, cultural, socioeconomic, environmental factors that influence child supervision in each context. For this reason, this is a good segue for our last slide, kind of looking to the future which is already the present of our team, because we've been working for the last few years on some of those areas, but future studies to consider other factors that might affect child-to-child supervision. For instance, seasonality. We know that during harvesting season, parents are likely to be in the fields and therefore less available to care for children. But what would happen in context of humanitarian response or when there is a presence or absence of certain policies? And this is something that we've been working on already, is looking at labor market policies such as parental employment policies and early childhood care and education policies to see whether the introduction of some of those policies increase or decrease the likelihood of children being by themselves or with their siblings without the presence of an adult. Studies that look at social cultural norms, very important. And again, our team has been conducting studies in Ghana and in Laos, particularly to test a procedure here, looking at what are the expectations of caregiving across age and sex groups, what is the perception in the community of what constitutes adequate supervision, and how could we measure it better. And then finally, for future research and intervention, to develop and evaluate interventions that are aimed at enhancing child supervision in low and middle income countries, with attention to both the prevalence and the incidence of child-to-child supervision. With that, we will thank again the rest of the MTC team, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada that funded this study, and are open to questions later on or collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica and Sam, for excellent presentation. A lot of insights. You ended your presentation 5 minutes before the scheduled time. So, colleagues, if you have any questions, you can actually type in the Q&A session so that we can take those questions at the end. So this is the time you have. In the meantime, I welcome Elena for her next presentation. Elena, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen, and thank you to the panelists before me. Sorry, I seems to be having issues, though we checked it just before.
No worries, this happens.
Exactly. Yeah, Doesn't seem to work.
You have 5 minutes to start. No worries.
Okay, now it should be working. Can you see my slide?
Yes, it's coming. You can go for full screen. Perfect.
Thank you
Floor
so
is
much.
yours.
Thank you. And thanks for having me. I'm presenting this work on behalf of my co-authors as well, Professor Franziska Gassman, Professor Wim Groot, and Dr. Bruno Martorano. We are all at UNU Merit and Maastricht University. And the title of my presentation is Child Work in Developing Countries, revisiting the differences and similarities between income generating and care and domestic work. So the motivation of our paper lie on the prevalence of child work and child labor. What we know from the latest statistics published by UNICEF and the ILO in 2021 with data up to 2020, we know that 160 million of children were in child labor, the most harmful type of child work. And I'll say a few words in a minute about the differences between child work and child labor. But in a nutshell, child work generally encompasses two types or two forms. On one end, economic activities, also called income generating activities, and household chores, also called care and domestic work, or sometimes unpaid household services. The statistical standards at the international level, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as research, often combine these two types of child work or neglect the latter, meaning they only focus on income generating work. And policies and programs have also similarly done so, generally focusing on reducing income generating work, especially due to the detrimental effects it can have on children's health and education, and therefore later on their employment, their poverty, and overall their well-being. The child work and child labor are two different concepts, but of course they are very much related. And child labor is essentially the most harmful form of child work as per the Sustainable Development Goal 8.7. There are two indicators to measure the prevalence of child labor. The first one only includes economic activities, and it's measured based on the age of the child and the number of hours that the child spends in a week on economic activities. And this is within the so-called SNA production boundary that refers to the system of national account and what kind of activities are counted as work and contributing to the GDP, for example. A second indicator also includes, in addition to income generating work, household chores, or as I was calling them earlier, unpaid care and domestic work. And similarly, it's also defined based on different hour threshold and the children's age. So if children are aged between 5 to 11, if they spend at least 1 hour per week on economic activities, they would be considered in child labor. If they spend either 1 hour per week or 21 hours per week in unpaid household services, they would be considered in child labor. However, when we look at the prevalence of these two forms of work, we see that there's the inclusion of household chores or unpaid care and domestic work in child labor estimates is actually quite non-negligible. So if you look at these graphs, you see a range of countries ordered by regions. You may not be able to recognize all the codes, but what you can see clearly is that when we include household chores in our definition of child labor, the prevalence is, of course, higher, and in some countries is particularly significantly higher. What does it mean for research, policy, and programming to essentially combine these two forms of child work or only focus on income-generating work? Essentially, it means that we may risk misguiding advice to governments in their policies and programs if we're not distinguishing and disentangling the different determinants of these two forms of child work, which may be different across different factors. So what we're doing in this paper is looking at empirical at this question and looking at whether indeed these two forms of child work are different or similar in both their prevalence as well as in determinants. So I'm going to briefly speak a little bit about the literature and then move on to the description of the data and methods. And I will show you the descriptive statistics and then the results of the regression, both at cross-country, and then I'll speak briefly about the country-specific regressions, and then I'll conclude with some discussions as well as implications for the research. So there's, as I was saying earlier, there's very few studies that actually, surprisingly perhaps, disaggregate and disentangle these two forms of child work when they look at the prevalence of the determinants. However, when we pull together all the different literature, what we see is that when it comes to gender, boys tend to do income generating work, girls tend to do unpaid care and domestic work, and age seems to increase both of these forms of work, though not necessarily in the same way. So it looks like the income generating work increases linearly when we move from a child age 5, for example, to a child age 17, whereas when it comes to unpaid care and domestic work, we see that, for example, studies by Young Lives that's done by the University of Oxford, these forms of work peaks at around early adolescence, or between the age of 11, 12. What we know from, for example, caregiver or household level factors, that an increase in household wealth or income does not necessarily reduce income generating work. For example, there's been literature that evaluated the introduction of cash transfers in different countries that were aimed at improving production, household production, and they found that they unintendedly also increased children's income generating work, but not, there's mixed findings when it comes to unpaid care and domestic work, and only a few studies, as I was saying earlier. When it comes to land and livestock ownership, similarly, we know from a few studies that it increased income generating work, but not necessarily unpaid care and domestic work, and so on. There are also other differences in the household composition. So what we do in this paper is taking 34 mixed surveys from around end of 2017 to March 2020. This means that we essentially exclude all surveys that were run after the COVID-19 pandemic. This is to avoid such a huge shock that has increased child labor, as we know. Overall, the 34 low and middle income countries represent around 900 million people, so about 1/8 of the global population, and includes over a third of those countries include fragile and conflict affecting settings. And they span across all the 7 UNICEF regions, so they provide quite a bit of variation in terms of income and characteristics and so on. A key variable come from the child labor module in the questionnaire for children age 5 to 17, where one child is randomly selected in each household, where there's at least one child of that age. So we have essentially 4 different types of dependent variables at both the extensive and the intensive margin. I'll show them in a minute, but these are the 2 lists of activities that are included in the 2 buckets, in the 2 forms of child work. On the left side, you see the 9 activities included as unpaid care and domestic work, and on the right side, those activities included as income generating work. So for unpaid care, we refer to shopping, cooking, cleaning, and for income generating work, we include both unpaid activities like working on the household's farm or helping in the household business, as well as paid activities such as selling products at the market or engaging in other forms of income generating work. So we estimate this model using probit model at the extensive margin and ordinary least squares at the intensive margin. And our dependent variables essentially are measured as at the extensive margin as a binary variable taking the value of 1 if the child engages or is involved in income generating work in at least one of the activities that I showed earlier for at least 1 hour. And similarly, another binary variable taking the value of 1 if the child participates in unpaid care and domestic work in at least one of the 9 activities that I showed earlier for at least 1 hour. At the intensive margin, we look at the number of hours that the child spends on each of these activities in aggregate term. And I'll speak to when I'll conclude, I'll say a few words about some of the limitations of how these dependent variables are measured. And then, drawing on the existing literature, we look at the determinants at the individual, caregiver, and household level So at the individual level, for example, we look, of course, at gender and age, as well as some other characteristics like the relationship to the household health or orphanhood. At the caregiver level, we look at mother's education, and at the household level, we look at the age and gender composition of the household, at the household livelihoods factors such as land and livestock ownership, and household infrastructure factors such as drinking water and electricity. So I'm showing here the descriptive statistics. You can see here the sample size, the mean, and the standard deviation. I've highlighted with the red circle the 4 key dependent variables. And essentially, you can see that when it comes to the 2 dependent variables at the extensive margin, the prevalence of income-generating work is 22%. That's the first line that says carried out any income-generating work. And as you can see from the below 4 slides, the most prevalent activity, most prevalent income-generating activity is working in the household farm. That's at 15%. When we move to the prevalence of care and domestic work, we see that that's much higher. It's 79%. So pretty much all children do some forms of care and domestic work. And most of these is actually shopping and cooking and cleaning. So more the domestic work rather than the care work. And it's interesting because the panelists before me presented on the other issue, on the care issue specifically. And then when we look at the intensive margin dependent variables, we see that instead the income generating work is much more intensive than care and domestic work. So as you can see here, children spend an average of 7.8 hours per week on income generating work and 5 hours on care and domestic work. I'm not gonna go through, of course, all of these bars, but essentially what you see here is how these prevalence rates change between different countries. You can see that there's quite a big difference, and you can see the prevalence in this graph, and instead the intensity in this other graph. So the blue, for example, indicator here measured the number of hours spent on income generating work. It can be very high in certain countries, especially in Sub-Saharan African countries, but also in some of the Middle Eastern, Northern African countries, and in Bangladesh, and less so in Europe and Central Asia, for example. When it comes to the independent variables, the sample is as a slight overrepresentation of boys compared to girls. The average age of the child is 11, so that's around early adolescence. Pretty much all children attended school in the current school year. So that's the school year of the survey, 89%. And the 3/4 of the children are children of the household head. So that's more, the majority live in a somewhat of a standard, let's call it like that, household setting. But of course, there are many others who are instead either grandchildren or they are head of the households themselves and so on. Most children are not orphans, and the majority of their children, the children's mother have attended other primary or lower secondary schools. So I'm presenting here the results of the regression. So the first thing that is probably comes to mind when you look at these results is that indeed, as the literature suggests, the pool analysis shows that gender actually plays out in opposite direction when it comes to these 2 types of child work. So it increases the care and domestic work at the extensive margin, so the likelihood that children engage in care and domestic work, and also the time that the girls spend on it, whereas it reduces, it's a negative association with income generating work. So meaning essentially that girls spend more time in care and domestic work and are more likely to engage in it, and boys spend more time on income generating work and are more likely to engage in it in the first place. The second red squares that you see look at age and how you can see they're all statistically significant, and what it shows is that there's not always there's somewhat of a linear trends, but not necessarily at the intensive margin. So you see how age is positively associated with all of the 4 dependent variables, and especially so at the intensive margin in that case. On the other hand, we see pretty much no effects, or at least no statistically significant effect when it comes to the child relationship to the household head and orphanhood. And here are the marginal effects. So what I presented earlier were regression coefficients, whereas these are marginal effects of the likelihood of carrying out income generating work and care and domestic work by the child's gender. So you see there's a difference when it comes to the care and domestic work. That's panel 2 on your right. And whereas on panel 1, you see pretty much more linear increase. At the caregiver level, we were thinking the mother's education would reduce all of these variables. So we would see negative associations, and instead we primarily see it at the intensive margin, meaning it's protective, but only when it comes to the time spent on either care and domestic work or in income generating work. And it's actually particularly protective for income generating work. We don't really see much at the extensive margin. So it doesn't necessarily reduce whether children engages in this work in the first place. And now moving on to the household level factors, we have these 3 categories: the household composition, the household livelihoods, and the household infrastructure. And again, what you see at the household composition level essentially is a range of factors that proxy either the care or labor supply or demand. So for example, the number of children under age 5, you see that increases the less time that older children spend on care and domestic work, but there's no much difference, or at least not statistically significant for any of the other dependent variables. And this indicator essentially proxies the care demand. Whereas if we look at the number of household members age 18 to 64, this indicator could proxy both care and labor supply. So the presence of adult members in the household reduces the likelihood that children spend time on care and domestic work. It also reduces the time that they spend on care and domestic work, but there's no statistically significant difference when it comes to both the likelihood and the time spent on income generating work. And just another point, when it comes to household livelihoods factors, we primarily see an effect of land ownership and livestock ownership and living in a rural area when it comes to the likelihood of carrying out any income generating work, but not much when it comes to care and domestic work. So we then looked at the variation between countries. I'm just summarizing a few points here. Essentially, the gender and age patterns still hold at the country level. There are very few exceptions. So there are a few countries where girls are, for example, more likely to carry out income generating work. That's contradicting to what we find in the pooled analysis. And a few other countries where boys spend more time on care and domestic work than girls. Whereas when we move to the caregiver and household level patterns, most are quite mixed. We do find that the role of household age composition on children's participation or involvement in care and domestic work is pretty much confirmed. So the factors that proxy care supply or demand are confirmed at most of the countries, but for income generating work, the results are much more mixed. We run a range of robustness checks at the extensive margin, for example, using OLS instead of PROBIT. At the intensive margin, we vary the way we treat the zeros and the missing values. If you're familiar with the child labor module in MIX, you would know that the way MIX collects data is having essentially the time spent on income generating work or the time spent on care and domestic work is equal to 0 if the children are spending less than 1 hour in a week, and we do some variation there. We also remove the outliers and do some log transformation, and across all of these first two sets of robustness checks, we find that our results are pretty much consistent. Where we do see a little bit of difference is when we exclude all of the fragile and conflict-affected countries. This, of course, suggests that in this context, there are some dynamics, probably gender and also childcare dynamics that are very specific and changes a little bit our results. So just to summarize, we see differences in the prevalence of these two forms of child work. We see some differences, definitely difference at the gender level in how gender determines these two types of child work, and the caregiving and household level factors. While there are some non-statistically significant results, we do see some differences in the way the household care supply and demand factors, for example, affect only one and not the other, and so on. So to conclude, these results and research suggests to more systematically report both forms of child work in separate, disentangling the two different prevalences to better guide policies, and calls also for better data collection when it comes to the way these indicators are collected. And I know the mixed team has been working on a time use module, which definitely can improve significantly this type of research and gives us way more nuanced insights to what children do and how they spend their time. It would also be ideal if future data collection could also inquire about the intended use of fetching water and collecting fuel, for example. At the moment, we don't really know whether the water or the fuel that children collect is used for unpaid care and domestic work or for the household farm, for example. And understanding this difference can improve the precision of the child labor estimates, as well as more broadly, other and more nuanced understanding on who makes decision in the household when it comes to children's time use. And that's also something that that's currently lacking in the mixed time use survey, mixed surveys in general, and that would be welcome. Thank you so much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Elena. What a great presentation. I mean, you covered almost all the different aspects. Colleagues, if you have any questions, you can type in the Q&A section so that we can take the opportunity to go to Utku for the third presentation. So, Elena, thank you very much. Utku, over to you. Utku is going to, Utku is going to make a presentation on compulsory schooling and child labor, the role of structural factors. Utku is coming from World Bank. And Utku, you are going to present by yourself, or you are also going to do a presentation in...
I'm going to present by myself.
Ah, perfect. Over to you, Utku. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Hello, welcome everyone. So the title of my speech today is Compulsory Schooling and Child Labor, the Role of Structural Factors. This is actually one chapter of my PhD thesis where we work with Belgi Turan from the Toby University of Economics and Technology. And I am currently working at the World Bank as an economist. So let me give a brief outline. I'll talk about the introduction and some related literature, and then I'll describe the data, model and our identification strategy, and we'll discuss the results. So basically, the main question that we're interested in is that the previous two, especially second, that child labor issue is a very delicate one because it could have long-term negative effects on child's both physical and mental health. That's fine, and therefore it's important to find ways to curb it. One important way to do this is through compulsory education, right? This is one of the policy tools that has been used widely to keep children in the school longer enough so that they cannot find time to devote on labor on providing labor. So basically, that's why that's the main issue of this presentation. And why is this important? As we have already heard from Elena, that like 160 million people, children are already working, and these numbers are very much underrated because this doesn't cover every type of work that they do. So basically, it's a big issue, and it is more important for low and middle income countries because the prevalence of child labor is very extremely high in those contexts. When we look at the literature, so the link between compulsory schooling and child labor, at least on the least developed and developing countries, is not where does not provide a very clear cut answer. And on top of that, the recent theoretical contributions tell us that there might be some structural factors that actually could facilitate keep or make it more difficult for this policy to work. And that's why, and also, uh, especially the causal studies with the developing countries mainly focus on one country specific examples, and they basically focus on association rather than causality. So we try to address this issue as well. So what's our contribution? We will conduct, first of all, a cross-country analysis of causal impact of compulsory schooling on child labor. The main identification tool that we're going to use, we'll discuss it more in detail, but is that we will focus on the changes in the compulsory schooling laws, right? And so we also introduce the role of structural factors into this policy framework. But we not only consider only governance-related indicators, but we consider a wide range of structural factors that could affect the link between or the impact of compulsory schooling on reducing child labor. So on the literature, I will focus on basically three papers. The first one, the first two are the theoretical papers. The first one is basically the backbone of our conceptual framework. So the idea is that if there is compulsory schooling and if it's well enforced, which depends basically on the quality of institutions, then child labor can be eliminated. But if the enforcement is not good enough because of the quality of institutions fail, let's say, and then these policies will not work. Um, in a similar manner, Lou shows that the compulsory schooling combined with government investment on education can actually help reduce the problem of child labor. On the other hand, recently, the Imoh's paper presents an evaluation of the political economy of these issues and specifically points to the role of income inequality, production structure, and governance as some critical structural factors. So basically, what is the data that we're using? We're using the mixed rounds we use rounds from 2 to 6, and that covers the period of 2000 until 2019. So basically, we use the mixed surveys from countries where they have child 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 section in the surveys, child labor section in the surveys, and also we identify those countries who actually changed their compulsory schooling laws during the periods that these surveys cover. Regarding the structural indicators, all the data comes from world development indicators and world governance indicators. I mean, mixed data has already been used previously to discuss issues related to child labor. There are just a few examples of that. And let's move to the core of our identification. So basically, we have identified 14 low and middle income countries who have changed their compulsory schooling laws within the period covered by the survey. For instance, if we move from the table, let's say, for instance, in Chad in 2006, the compulsory schooling has been increased from 6 years to 10 years. and we identify the school starting years in each country, and then we try to locate the birth year of the cohort that will be subject to higher years of compulsory schooling. For instance, if we continue from Chad example, those children who were born in 1994 and afterwards are subject to 10 years of compulsory schooling, but those who were born in earlier years are subject to 6 years of compulsory schooling. So um, we will use this opportunity to identify the causal impact of increasing compulsory years of schooling. So let's give some descriptive statistics of child employment in our data for those countries. So basically, as you see, for instance, for the age group of 11 to 17, for instance, in Chad, the prevalence of child labor is 53%, in Ghana 52%, Guinea-Bissau 64%. So these are very, very high numbers. And let me remind you that in this presentation, we focus on income generating activity that Elena has very nicely depicted in her previous presentation. So basically, these are activities performed either in a family business or outside, but in order to generate income. And the per, and for the whole sample of countries, and for the other indicators, so the overall the prevalence of child labor is 40%, and we use obviously in our analysis different control variables, and the control variables that we use include the age, gender, and household heads, age, and the household wealth scores, size, mother's education, and we use two indicators whether mother and father is is alive. So the identification strategy, as we said, the so we have a panel of children from different countries from different survey rounds, where Y is the outcome, which is basically whether the child is working or not. And here the main coefficient of interest in the first specification is beta one. Beta one shows whether those children who are exogenously subject to higher years of schooling are working less or not, because P is our indicator variable which shows whether the child is affected from the policy change or not. We use, apart from the variables that I discussed, we also use control variables for country and year fixed effects, regions within the country fixed effects, and also age fixed effects. So this is our main specification. In the second specification, on top of that, we introduce the role of structural factors. This time, as you can follow from the second specification, we interact the policy indicator also with a structural indicator this time to see whether this structural indicator uh, helps or prevents or increases or strengthens or weakens the effect of compulsory schooling on reducing child labor. And so we are estimating linear probability models, and obviously in the second specification, the overall policy effect will depend not only in B1 this time, but beta 1 and BT2 plus the level of structural indicator itself. So basically, let me start with the first table of results. This is the results for the first specification, where we investigate whether actually compulsory schooling reduces child labor or not. And the simple answer is yes. So we have different columns where we include different control for different control variables. For instance, when we weight with the with countries populations, or we include region of the world dummies as well rather than country dummies, or when we exclude the top 5 of the wealthiest households in the regressions, or even when you consider only the surveys where both treated and untreated observations are available. So basically the answer is yes, the compulsory schooling lowers mm, child labor in the context of low and middle income countries as well. So now you're moving to the second set of results when we introduce the structural indicators. So we grouped the structural indicators in six different type headings. The first one is those structural indicators related to demography and population characteristics. So the findings here is that the lines that we're focusing is the bold lines where we have the policy indicator where a child is subject to higher compulsory schooling interacted with the structural indicators. So in this case, significantly positive numbers will tell us that that structural indicator weakens the effect of compulsory schooling on lowering child labor, and significant and negative coefficients will tell us that such a structural indicator will actually strengthen the impact of compulsory schooling on reducing child labor. So if you look at the demography and population characteristics, for instance, if the old age dependency ratio is higher, the policy effect is weaker. But on the other hand, so the life expectancy of females and the population growth and the share of rural population actually are the factors that help the compulsory schooling policy to be more successful. Uh, Let's look at the second set of indicators, which are related to women's role in the society and gender equality. So basically, the main finding is that if the role of women in the both in decision making, such as like indicators like the proportion of seats held by the women in the parliament, or in economic activity, ratio of female labor force participation, the ratio of females in all self-employment, are actually telling us that in societies or in countries where the women participate more in social and economic activities, the policy works much better. In terms of income inequality, this is related to the topics that we've already discussed. The policy effect is much weaker in countries where the income inequality is the income is more unequally distributed. Let's put it this way. In terms of labor market or employment related statistics, one common finding is that relates to unemployment. In countries where we have higher unemployment or higher structural unemployment, let's put it this way, the policy is less effective because children think that if they have a job, it's still reasonable to keep it because otherwise, if they continue to education, they might not be able to find it. So but on the other hand, if the social programs are effective in the country, then the policy is more effective because now the social programs reduces the need of money or income that is generated by children so that they can enjoy more time in school out of out of education. Regarding infrastructure, this is related to basically the returns on education, right? If the returns on education are higher, then it's more wise to stay in school rather than going to work. And the indicators and our results support this. For instance, if the government's expenditure on education increases or the share of trained teachers in schools increases, the policy works much better. Another factor is that business dynamism and the general infrastructure. So basically, the policy is much more effective in more dynamic economic environments where, let's say, the investments are higher, the trade activities are higher, access to electricity in urban areas is more available, more mobile cellular subscriptions are available, and also in cases where we have a higher human capital index value. On the contrary, in economies where the informal sector has a higher share, the policy is much less effective. Finally, regarding governance and policy effectiveness indicators, we only find significant impact from political stability and from fiscal and macro management and rating. So basically, in more politically stable and in better in countries with better fiscal and monetary policy ratings, governance, basically, the policy impact is much more stronger. So basically, let me briefly discuss the findings that I just run. First of all, we established the causal link between compulsory schooling and child labor in low and middle income countries, and the effects are actually not very not very negligible. So the policy reduces the incidence of child work for 11 to 17-year-old children by about 7 to 13%, depending on the specification. And also in the second stage, when we introduce the structural factors, we find that actually the structural indicators are actually impactful on this link between compulsory schooling and child labor. So for instance, the policy effect is weaker if all dependence ratio is higher, if income inequality is higher, or if the size of informal sectors is larger, or in countries where the share of service and employment is more elevated. On the contrary, the policy effect is stronger in such structural environments where the government spending in education as a percent of GDP is higher, when the women's participation in decision making, both in household and macro levels, improves, or in more dynamic economies with higher investments and trade links, and also in countries with higher human capital uh, quality ratings and greater political stability. So basically, in this paper, we provide causal evidence on the successful impact of compulsory schooling on reducing child labor for 14 a panel of 14 low and middle income countries. And regarding the structural issues, we go beyond only governance related indicators, but cover a wider range of structural indicators. And basically, the results is that to increase the effectiveness of compulsory schooling policies in reducing child labor, definitely any structural obstacles should also be tackled simultaneously. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Utku. Now it's turn for all the participants who are attending this for the Q&A session. While you are typing, I would like to thank all the four presenters. I mean, you all did a great job in terms of further analyzing, researching, and bringing new perspective to this platform. All the inputs are there for policy and program colleagues. They can actually get a new perspective from your analysis. And bringing the multi-country analysis is very valuable for all of us. Thank you very much to all. Turgay, over to you for further comments. And there are some questions from over to you.
Thanks, Deepak. Yeah, we have indeed a few questions for the presenters. I will start from the first one. This question is coming from Deborah Levison for the first presenters, Monica and Samaneh. And she thanks for this interesting presentation. And the question goes like this: why didn't authors control for mother's fertility in addition to mother's age? Children never born affects the presence of older children who could be caregivers, and education is highly correlated with fertility. How do authors know that they are not just picking up the effects of fertility in the education variable? There is another question. Actually, this time it's coming from Deepak to the first presenters. Excellent presentation. Your findings are insightful. Did you try to include mother or father's occupation variable and wealth to understand any influence on adequate supervision? Actually, I will continue reading the questions to the second presenter and then follow up, then see if we will be getting any more. So again, a question from Deborah Levinson for the second presenter. Thank you for this. I wonder if you did a similar analysis for hours of labor force work, not just participation, intensive versus extensive margin. Also, do you think that some of your structural indicators may be proxies for enforcement of the increased years of compulsory schooling? And I think this is it. Okay, let's start with these questions, and I will follow and monitor the Q&A. Over to you, Monica and Samaneh.
Thank you. Shall I take this one, Monica? Okay, thank you. Well, regarding the first question, it's a really nice point that they mentioned. First of all, what we did in our analysis, we adjusted for the effect of household size, which contains the information basically, and the household size is basically the number of occupants living in a household, including the children. And according to our preliminary analysis, we realized that, and it makes sense that there is highly correlated with the number of children. So in some sense, we adjusted for the effect of fertility. We did also some preliminary analysis with the potential confounding variables. And what we did in our analysis was basically we adjusted for those that were significant in our model. So due to this analysis, we ended up with this 7 number of covariates. And however, we encourage for future analysis to see whether results with adjusting for fertility differs from the results without adjusting for this variable. But overall, what I can say is that it's a very nice point that they raise. And I think it's good that we can do some preliminary analysis about fertility rates and how it differs by rural and urban areas, education, wealth index, and other potential variables. Thank you.
Okay, before I proceed, I think I misdirected the second question of Deborah Levinson. So Deborah's question is for Utku. Let me repeat the question. I wonder if you did a similar analysis for hours of labor force work, not just participation, intensive versus extensive margin. And also, do you think that some of your structural indicators may be proxies for enforcement of the increased years of compulsory schooling? And we have one question to Elena, second presenter from Deepak. Great presentation, several inputs for program policy consideration. One quick question: Did you or your team consider how mixed data collection period or seasonality influence your analysis? So over to you, Elena, and then to Utku.
Shall I respond to the last question? Sorry, Elena. Shall I respond to the last question for the first presenter quickly? before we go on. The second question was about mother and father's occupation and then wealth. So very rapidly, well, the first one is not available. We wish we had that information. For the second one, for wealth, we did control for wealth in our model, as Sam said, because our actually already published work has showed that that was one of the confounders. But we also have found in the past, in looking across countries, that in most countries, except for Uruguay, children are less likely to be supervised by another child in wealthier households. So that's kind of a bit of information you might find already in published literature. Thank you. I'll let Elena take on the next question.
Thanks so much, Deepak, for your questions. We didn't control for the seasonality of the survey, so maybe that's something that we should check there. However, there are many countries, so I'll have to think. But I think it's an interesting point and definitely probably affects income generating work more than the other form of child work. But yeah, thank you for the suggestion. We may look into that.
Over to Utku.
Hello, thank you, Turgay. Thank you for the question. Well, for the first part, we didn't work with the hours of labor because this data was not available in most of the surveys, unfortunately. And as for the second part, yes, obviously some of the structural indicators that we consider are actually related to enforcement of this compulsory schooling policy, which is actually a proxy for quality of institutions as well. You're right, and as we saw that in political stability case or in some other governance indicators, we see that these are the issues that actually strengthens the effect of compulsory schooling on reducing child labor. But also what we do here is that we go beyond that. We not only consider the enforcement issues, but we also consider issues like the opportunities, right? If the economic environment is vibrant, or if there is actually a investment in schooling by the government. So these are the issues that could increase the marginal returns on education, right? So we also show that these issues are also impacting this relation positively. On top of that, we also consider the role of women in the country. This also resonates in the previous two presentations as well. When the policies run through women, they are much more effective on children. We also support these arguments. Obviously, enforcement is an important issue, but we also consider other structural issues that could mitigate or that could affect this relation. Thank you.
All right, I don't see any other question, so over to you, Deepak.
Thank you very much, Turgay. And maybe it's time to conclude. We have only 1 minute left. The chair and co-chair takes the opportunity to thank the presenters and all the authors for their insightful contributions, bringing diverse perspective, and their dedication to advancing the understanding of child labor in mix. So thank you very much, and thanks to all the attendees for joining this important session. Have a nice evening. Take care.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.